So a month ago, I saw a story in the Washington Post, and it was about a gazillionaire who was searching for the fountain of eternal youth. And I thought, oh my gosh, that is a sermon for Lent if there ever was, right? Because, you know, Lent is this sweet invitation that invites us to be okay with our limits, with our vulnerability. We talked about that last week, right? You've got this couple, and at the beginning they're naked and they're not ashamed. It's another way of saying they're vulnerable and it felt appropriate. So they're kind of all right, they're okay, they're down with that. You know, we're human, we're limited, we're finite. And then the serpent comes along, and the serpent's like, kind of stirring up their anxiety, and then things kind of fall apart. Or there's that classic scripture for the first Sunday of Lent where Satan, or Hasatan, the adversary, is kind of trying to get under Jesus' skin. Oh, you immortal, all-powerful one, why don't you just throw yourself off this cliff and let the angels pick you up? How about taking these loaves, these stones, and turning them into loaves of bread? Or look at all this, all these kingdoms, all of this can be yours. And Jesus is like, no, I'm okay. I'm all right with the kind of limited world that God has provided here. That's all right with me. Well, not Brian Johnson, the 45-year-old who lives in Venice, California, whose goal is to have the body of an 18-year-old. If not forever, then at least as long as he can. And considering he's a gazillionaire, he's able to spend several $1 million a year on this effort. So in his home, he has his own medical suite, and he has 30 doctors that help him with this goal. He wakes up every morning to begin treatments and transfusions, to follow this exact diet and exact physical regime. And then when it comes time to bed, he goes to bed at the exact same time every night after he wears these specific goggles for 2 hours. And he's hooked up to all these machines. He's had over 33,000 images of his bowels made. And he has something to also measure his nightly erections, because again, his goal is to be an 18-year-old forever. And when I read this story, then my first thought was, well, this is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. And then I thought, you know, how incredibly sad, too. You know, it just feels like the absolute opposite of living in the moment, right? Of being present in the moment. You know, the run this morning, I was like, oh my gosh, the sunshine on my face, and to be injury-free, and then the hot tea, and then the hot shower, and then this moment right here that we're all experiencing together. I mean, to just live as presently as we can in the moment, right? Not regretting yesterday and not worrying about tomorrow, and yet he's got a life that every single moment is about extending the moment until the next moment, right? I mean, that's got to be a pretty anxious thing. But it wasn't just sad that, you know, he seems cut off from this world and like, are you going to be in bubble wrap? I mean, you walk out the door, couldn't a branch on a hike hit you and take you out? Or, you know, couldn't someone shoot you at the garlic festival or T-bone you at the intersection? You know, but instead of just living presently, not just being cut off from that, but also being cut off from other people around you. And that was really what this opinion piece in the Washington Post was about. The author was contrasting the health care that the ultra-rich can now have with the health care of the poor, and in many ways the middle class. And the person was talking about up the coast from Mr. Johnson was a poor man, a farm worker who had been shot in the Half Moon Bay massacre that killed 7 people. He was a migrant worker, farm worker. He picked mushrooms, and Governor Newsom had come to see him, and the farm worker had thanked the governor. His leg was shattered with the gunfire, and then he said, I have to get out of here today. I can't possibly afford the bill, and I have to get back to my job. And the governor pointed out that this gentleman made $9 an hour, and he lived in a shipping container. And he had no resources, no support, no days off, certainly no sick leave. And the author was contrasting these two. And the author was saying, you know, we think they may be disconnected, but they're really kind of connected. And went on to quote Doug Rushkoff, who I've quoted before, who wrote Survival of the Richest, Escape Fantasies of the Tech Billionaires. It's not that the homeless and impoverished people are being ignored by the wealthy. They are the very impetus for these escape fantasies to begin with. They represent the death and decay that the tech bros want to deny. Lent comes to us every year as a season in which we're invited to look at the death decay in a different way, in a broader way. And the psalm this morning is just one of the most delicious ones ever. I lift my eyes to the hills, from where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. This Lord will not let your foot stumble. This Lord never slumbers. This Lord, the God of Israel, never sleeps. The God of Israel never slumbers. We're told 3 times right here, God's going to stay awake. And what have we been saying? When the Hebrew repeats something, they want you to get it. Guess what? At the end of the day, after you've done your best, after you've sought God's justice and peace, after you've loved those close and far, you know what? You can close your eyes and go to sleep. Guess what? Not even hooked up to any monitors, because God has got you. Because God never slumbers and God never sleeps. And then if we don't get it, the psalm goes on, the poet continues with this beautiful image of this God who is your guardian, this God who is protecting, this God who's got you coming and going day and night. And in case we don't get it, in Hebrew, the word shomar, the verb there, is used 6 times. 6 times, you know, it's like guardian, protecting, watching, seeing, observing, keeping. I mean, this God has got you. But it doesn't stop there, because that word shomar, we heard that last week in Genesis 2. When that earth creature, it was the earth creature. God took that earth creature, right? Put that earth creature in the garden to till it and to keep it. Shomar, to keep it. So it's not just that God is keeping us. What are we doing? We're keeping one another. And I've been thinking, I wonder if keeping one another, if looking out for one another, if trying to work for a different world where we all have enough, might in the end help us close our eyes each night and have a good night's sleep. I've been thinking about President Carter. He's been in the news a good bit, 98 now. Everybody knows he's gone home from his cancer treatments on hospice. Well, most of us, if we're old enough, remember President Carter, and we think about a one-term president. You know, he was considered kind of inept, kind of ineffective, maybe impotent would be a good word here right now. Of course, he had inflation and soaring interest rates, and he had the Iran hostage crisis, which he really did deal with, but he wasn't given credit for. And at the end of his term, he went home, and we all know that he has weathered the test of time quite well, right? That he's remembered now for his honesty and his integrity, that he went home from the White House, and unlike Ford before him and the presidents who followed, you know, he didn't cash in at all. He didn't have any interest in, you know, sitting on corporate boards or writing speeches that he would get tens of thousands of dollars for. He just said he never had any interest in being rich. And when he went home to Plains, Georgia, his little peanut farm that had been in a blind trust was in debt for $1 million, and they had to sell it. They went back to their 2-bedroom home there where they still live. That's valued at $167,000. And the president, though, has been remembered, I think, favorably for being ahead of his time when it came to the environment, being ahead of his time when it came to equality. His passion, of course, for trying to broker some kind of peace deal in the Middle East, Camp David Accords. And he's remembered, of course, not just for all of that, but for his really deep Baptist faith. You know, he's taught Sunday school there at the Maranatha Baptist Church for, I think longer than I've been alive. And there was a story a few years ago about Carter. He had come home from the hospital. They told him brain cancer or liver cancer. And the article was about how he said he was at peace with death, that whether he lived or whether he died, it didn't really matter. He said, you know, I would really miss my family, and I would miss my work at the Carter Center, and I would miss teaching my Sunday school class, but I'm really at peace with death. And I'm sure the fact that he's in his 10th decade helps that. But I think there's also, again, something about the life he's lived, which has also been synonymous with Habitat for Humanity, that the Fullers kind of were starting that when he was in Georgia, and he's credited with something like building 4,300 homes, like in 14 different countries. I mean, until recent years, getting out there with the belt and doing all that stuff, right? I mean, is there not a connection between caring and keeping one another and going to sleep at night, closing your eyes, knowing, you know, I've done the very best I can? And it's not just presidents, right? You know, our little peace community, we try to live that way too. We try to, even though we're very connected, we try to be very outward focused. So I think about right now, there's a couple of things we're working on. One, on the Kansas side, trying to expand Medicaid, because Kansas is one of 11 states in the country that hasn't expanded Medicaid. And on the Missouri side, a new thing that we're working on with Stand Up KC and others is the Clean Slate Initiative. The Clean Slate Initiative is a way that you can expunge people's records who have done their time, who are off probation, off paper, but are still hindered by, having a record. And if you think having a record's not a big deal, you should look at the statisticians who say there's something like 50,000 things that can trip you up, including the biggest two, right? Which are getting a job and getting a place to live. Not to mention little kids in the house can't get food stamps if someone's in the house who's been a former felon. Do you know how many people in the state of Missouri, 6.2 million people, have some kind of criminal record? 1.8 million have got something. Do you know how many people have an offense that can be expunged right now? They have done all of their work. They are ready to be completely clear. 518,000 people have already done everything they're supposed to do. That's the exact figure, 518,000. Do you know how many records were expunged last year? 894. Because it is complicated and expensive to do it. And so the Clean Slate Initiative is a way of kind of brushing that aside and saying, once you've done all these things, it's kind of an automatic expunsion. I think Garrison's working on it in his law school stuff right now, so keep going. But I think about those 518,000. Some of you know Fran Marion. She's one of the leaders in Stand Up KC. She preached here last year. I think it was the 1st of October with Daniel Tucker, and Fran spoke. Fran is an amazing person. I think she came in to preach from being at Taco Bell, and then she left and went to Burger King. A lot of people who work fast food, they work at multiple places. She's been to DC, she's testified. I didn't realize until this week that when Fran was a younger woman trying to feed her kids, she wrote a hot check for $700, and she served 6 years in federal prison for that $700 check. 6 years away from her children for a $700 check. And when she came home, 9 years probation. 9 years probation, which she got down to 5 years because of good behavior. Fran Marion, who we know, who's one of our friends, who's one of our sisters, is one of those people who would be helped by just having your record expunged when you have done your time and paid your debt, right? But it's not just stuff out there that we seek to care about. We seek to care about one another, which is why we have this shepherding program where me and Paula try to keep track of everybody and try to be sure that we've got a couple hundred people in this where we kind of reach out and connect one another. And in February, Alex and Christy Holsinger spoke. We had a little gathering over there, and they talked about the future of higher education. They were both criminal justice profs and now vice provost and associate dean. And their whole life has really been about trying to expand access. I think that would be fair to say. Especially UMKC is very focused on first generation students, very, very focused on kids of color and trying to expand, trying to create a world of more equity. And it was a really helpful presentation. And those of us who were here, it was a very lively discussion. I mean, a lot of us, everybody feels very passionately about this. I think that'd be fair to say that, we all know that college debt is a remarkably big stumbling block that, that trying to get through, that our young people have a lot against them. And it was a really powerful conversation. And then 2 of our young adults spoke up. Tara spoke up and asked something about, the value of a college education, at a time when, it costs so much. And Selena raised her hand. I asked Selena if I could mention this, but Selena raised her hand and she said, I want to share my story. And when she began to share her story, it'd be fair to say that the whole mood in the room changed, that everybody moved in because you could see it and you could feel it in her voice and her vulnerability. And she talked about how tough it had been for her at UMKC, that she was on her own financially. Nobody else was footing the bill, that she was a Pell Grant student. And she talked not just about the struggle with that, she also talked about her own emotional mental health during college, right? I mean, we all know that. Depression, anxiety. Did you see that story this week? Our girls are not okay. Like what, 50%, 60% of girls have thought about suicide, and in the LGBT community, it's 75. I mean, it's just, and she talked about this journey, and all the while she was talking, it was like the holiness of God. I mean, it was like Jesus had descended on them. I mean, I'm serious. How many of you were there and you can remember that moment? And everybody was just kind of leaning in towards Selena. And this beautiful woman was sharing vulnerably and rawly and really with all of us. And for a moment, it just totally changed the community. It took us to a different place. Like, do we want to be real and honest with one another? Do we want to say, like, God, this is friggin' hard? Our kids are struggling. How can we reach out and be more caring to one another? It's Lent. The world is a vulnerable place. We do not have that much control. Cancer, climate catastrophe, all the stuff that we care. I mean, we want to protect our kids. We want to protect our parents. We want to bubble wrap those people we love. We only have so much ability. We're vulnerable. We're finite. We're limited. What does it mean each night to go to bed, to crawl under the sheets, to think, where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, the one who does not slumber or sleep, the one who calls me in every single moment to move towards love, to move towards one another, to care for one another, to till and to keep this earth. So in this Lenten season, may we close our eyes at night, confident that this God is with us, confident that this one who calls us forward in love shows up at the very end as that seamstress who makes us a garment of grace, a cloak of protection. May it be so. Amen.